as I was thinking about what I was going to say tonight, and the role of history and fact in writing fiction, I realized that footnotes have played an important part of my writing career. And I don't mean footnotes in the postmodern, 3-page long, smarty pants, David Foster Wallace kind of footnotes, although I have to confess I am guilty of a few of those. But I mean the old-fashioned, unironic kind of footnote at the bottom of the page, there for citation, clarification, or illumination. And for me, as I was thinking about this, I thought this talk could be called The Tale of Two Footnotes. Because two footnotes have played a very important part in what I ended up writing. The first was one that I discovered many, many years ago, embedded in an essay, a very dry academic essay about gender theory in a very dry academic collection of essays about gender theory. And in this essay, the author was writing about gender and the constructs of gender and how to use gender as a lens of reading fiction and history. And this is not how I think. I don't think in those terms. I think in terms of story and character and narrative. And my eyes were glazing over, and then there was a footnote at the bottom of this page. And in this footnote, it mentioned someone named Einar Wegener. And it said that Einar Wegener was the first transsexual in history, and that he had been a painter in Copenhagen and Paris in the 1920s and 30s, and that in the early 1930s he traveled to Dresden and underwent a series of operations and became the first transgender woman in history. And then it went back to this discussion of gender theory and Michel Foucault, and I didn't go back to that. I just looked at that footnote, I thought, what? Because I'd heard of Christine Jorgensen, whom you might have heard of, who many people think of as the first transsexual. And I also was just intrigued why I'd never heard of this person, and that he'd been a painter, and the time, the 1920s and 1930s in Paris and Germany, that says a lot right there. So I decided to look this up. And this was in the 90s. The internet existed, but it wasn't my first inclination to go to the internet. My first inclination was to go to the library. And so I went to the New York Public Library. And I only had this name, Einar Wegener, and I couldn't find anything that illuminated the question of who he was. And that's because I didn't have the name of the woman that he eventually became. But once I figured that out, and figured out that her name was Lily Elbe, I realized that she was once a really well-known person, and that her story of how she became the first person to turn to medicine and surgery to change her gender, at the time, in the early 1930s, was a sensational story, because nobody had ever heard of anything like that. Nobody had imagined anything like that. And I saw the newspaper articles about her, and I saw the illustrations of her that ran in those newspaper articles, and I just was really intrigued by who she was and why history had forgotten her. But there was something else that I was finding immediately in these newspaper articles about her that was telling me something that kind of led to fiction. And that was that hovering around her story, and what I read about her story, was the fact that as a man, he had been married to another artist, and a woman named Gerda Wegener, and that she somehow played a really important role in this transformation. I didn't do anything right away with this information. It just seemed, it seemed like a good story, but I wasn't sure what to do about it. or how to do anything with it, but I kept thinking about it for about 6 months, and that told me, the fact that it stayed with me for 6 months told me that it was a story that had many layers and that I wanted to know more about. I hadn't published a book at this point. I had published a few stories in small journals. I had no discernible writing career. I wanted to write a novel, but I was very, very early in that, and I decided to take my vacation time and go to Denmark, where he was from, where Einar was from, and where this story started. And at the time I told my boss I was going to Denmark on vacation, and he said, "What for?" Because he didn't know I wanted to be a writer. And I said, "To visit a friend." And I went to Copenhagen and just started looking around. And I knew a few things. I knew that he had been a professor at the Royal Academy of Arts, and that the wife, Gerda, had been one of his students. So I went there, and what I found, the academy still stands. It's still in the exact same place it was when they were there. And what this school has done is they keep a file of every student that's ever attended. And so they had art files on these two figures, and this is where the story opened up for me, because what I found was that Gerda had been, Einar as a painter had been a very successful painter in his day. He was a very traditional painter of landscape paintings. But Gerda was a more innovative painter, and at the time of their marriage, she was not at all successful, and people weren't as interested in her art. She painted people, and she painted people in what you might think of sort of as an Art Deco kind of style, but this was in the early 1920s, and that style hadn't quite caught on. But there was a point in their marriage, after about 6 years, when Gerda recognized something about her husband, that he wasn't who he thought he was. And one day she asked him, she was painting an opera singer, and her singer didn't come for the painting, for the session, and she needed a model. And she asked her husband to put on the singer's dress so that she could finish the painting she was working on, where the hem of the dress fell against the singer's legs, and she needed to look at that, Gerda did. And she asked her husband to put on this dress, and because they were artists, it didn't seem a particularly crazy thing to do, just they were very helpful with each other's art, and he did. And she saw something happening to him that he couldn't even recognize himself. And what ended up happening is she started painting her husband dressed as a woman. And these paintings became very celebrated. And this really launched her career as an artist. And everybody, they were called the Lily paintings, and that was the name that she gave her husband when he was dressed as a woman, and everybody wanted to know who Lily was, and it was a secret. And they moved to Paris, and this kind of grew and grew in the late 1920s, and Gerda's career really took off because of these paintings. And in those files that I was telling you about, I found these paintings of Lily done by Lily's wife. And that's where the story kind of opened up for me, because I thought that one of the things that I think is important to think about when writing historical fiction there are two questions. It's why write a story as fiction, and then how. And with the story of Lily Elbe, the why was kind of coming clear as I was looking at the art, and as I was looking at how Gerda had painted Lily. I realized that the story that fiction could illuminate and that history couldn't, because the facts just weren't recorded, was the story of their marriage and the space of their marriage, that is that very private, dark space that exists in an intimate relationship, and that could be the role of fiction, and that's what a novel could do we had, in the archives, there are letters from Einar and Lily, there's Einar's art, there are all the newspaper articles, there's some personal statements, there's a little bit of diary entries, but they don't say a whole lot about what went on in that marriage. And the more I thought about it, and the more I looked at the art, and really these paintings of Lily are sort of the best representation, kind of the representation of her, I realized this is the way into this story, and this is how I could tell it and make it perhaps unique. And so the why began to get answered by my thinking about balancing out the book as a book about the two of them, and that I would follow the historical record of Einar's transformation into Lily, but then I would fill in with what wasn't there, which is the love story. The story of a marriage that undergoes a radical transformation and that has to ask itself, how much change can a marriage withstand before it's become something else? And that's what led me to The Danish Girl, and the book moves back and forth from, it's in third person, but goes from Einar's point of view to Gerda's point of view. In the book I call her Greta as a distinction, and then Einar, Greta, Lily, Greta, Einar, Greta, Einar, and then gradually Einar becomes Lily, and Einar is no longer present in the book. The second footnote came many, many years later, maybe 5 or 6, in a really different way. At this point, I had published The Danish Girl and another novel and a book of stories, and I was working on a new novel that I was struggling with, and that it was a dark story. Nearly everybody in it ended up dead at the end, and it was a hard book to write. And I didn't listen to something that I have said to my students in the past, which is, if you're not having any fun writing the book, your reader is not going to have any fun reading the book. And yet I kept pushing at it, and it was a miserable task. But one day I was at work, this was in my job at Random House, and one of the things I used to do there, I was the publishing director of the Modern Library, our classics imprint, and we would reissue new editions of the classics. You know, a new edition of Huckleberry Finn or Jane Eyre, and what we would do is commission a new set of endnotes for that, just as you would think, and we would contact a scholar to write those endnotes. And so I was working on a book, and I needed a scholar of 19th century women's history to write a set of endnotes. And I found a woman at Case Western University who had an expertise that seemed to match the book well. And I called her up and talked about this project, and I wanted to have her write the footnotes. And we started talking, and I really was drawn in by what her academic experience was, that her expertise is the lives of 19th century American women, but women who aren't really famous to us today, but whose lives are representative of their times in one way or another. And so this was kind of a boring day at the office, and she was so much more interesting than what was on my desk, and I just let her tell story after story about woman after woman, people I'd never heard of, but they were so dynamic, and we just were going on for about an hour. And in this conversation she said, "Oh, and let me tell you about the 19th wife." And I said, "The 19th what?" Because the number 19 is a really unusual number in front of the word wife.